week 9 of RV life was full of exploring Yellowstone yet again, and on Sunday, we started off going to the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, which isn't really the Grand Canyon, as I'm sure you know, that's its own national park. But the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone is about 2 hours away. It's on the east side of Yellowstone, and really it was just an amazing time, and you should definitely go there. There's 2 waterfalls, Upper Falls, Lower Falls. Upper Falls, I believe, is about 100 feet, and the Lower Falls is 200 to 300 feet.
It's over 300 feet.
It's over 300 feet, so it's even better.
Yeah, so it's over 300 feet, and this is, again, one of the most popular spots in Yellowstone, so per the usual, we were really trying to get there early and beat the crowds, which we relatively succeeded in, which is super nice. So there's kind of an upper and a lower rim of this particular set of falls. You can drive both, and they have different lookout points and things like that, so you get different views of one or the other of the falls. There's very few points that you can actually see both of them, so you're kind of focusing on one or the other. I would say my favorite was this area called Artist's Point, which is beautiful. You got this huge view of the lower falls. It was absolutely stunning, and you're getting to see all of the canyon in between you and it as well.
Yeah, Artist's Point was probably the best viewpoint, because most of the other ones, you're like on the side of the river, on the side of the canyon looking into it. And on Artist's Point, the canyon goes out in curves, and where it curves, that's where you're standing. So you're looking straight at a 300-foot waterfall through a massive canyon. It's really, really amazing. Pictures don't do it justice, and the pictures look amazing. So, I mean, we could have stayed there for probably hours.
Yeah.
But we were trying to beat the crowds. And we say early, I think we got there around 8:30, 9 o'clock with the drive, and it was still crowded. Like, we could find a parking spot. But I could see if you get there after like 10 or 11 o'clock, there's a good chance
it would be insane.
There won't be any parking spots. They're very hard to find, especially if you're driving in an RV. We had a car.
Yeah, there's very little RV parking, so definitely recommend if you have a tow, park your RV somewhere else and then bring your tow in instead. And as far as like viewpoints for the upper falls, there's not as many. We saw it first at Uncle Tom's Point, which actually isn't very well labeled, but if you take the lower rim loop, it's the first turn on your left, and that's where you really get to see an overview of the falls. So you definitely should see it, but I think or at least my favorite experience of the viewpoint was whenever we went to the brink of the upper falls, because you're standing right at where it flows over the lip, and it was just really neat to kind of feel all of this like water and the pressure and the spray come up at you.
That viewpoint is really unlike all of the other ones, because like Haley just said, like at the top of the waterfall, and you can just see everything rushing down, all the water. You can like feel it. You're a safe distance away from the water and the waterfall, but you can still like feel the power of like thousands of gallons going off like constantly. We were there probably for longer than most people were watching it, because it was just really cool.
Yeah, it was really spectacular. There's a lot of other viewpoints there for both of the falls. We didn't do all of them. We're still with my family, and they weren't as keen on hiking down like 600 feet for those, so we're hoping to go sometime later this week or next week to get to see the rest of those.
Then we went to lunch at Falls Grill, which is kind of this big cafe area. They had a couple different like dining options. I believe it's at a campground.
This is at the Canyon Village way like point, so there's a lot of different places to eat there, not even just in this one cafeteria section, but the cafeteria I think had like 4 or so different options. We went a little late, so there wasn't a ton left open, but it was still okay.
Yeah, got the flatbread pizza. It was good. I'd recommend it, but it's not like a need to stop at. But
I agree.
If you're in the area looking for lunch, it's a good option.
Right around the corner from the falls, yeah. And I have a strong suspicion it gets very crowded during peak hours.
From lunch, we were then making our way over to the West Thumb Geyser Basin, and on the way stopped at Sulfur Canyon, which is, I believe, the most acidic geyser in the park.
Yeah, it's thankfully not a geyser. It's just a basin of water, but it is 1 to 2 pH, so that's about the pH of battery acid or your stomach. So very thankful that it was kind of below you, and it smells awful. Fun fact.
Yeah, you get out and you can like taste it. Like you can only stand out there for so long, and it is just, it's terrible. It was a smelly viewing point.
The pH of that actually means that it would literally melt your skin off, so I do not recommend going jumping in Sulfur Basin. From there, we went on, continued down the road, again, still headed toward the West Thumb Geyser Basin. We stopped at LeHardy Rapids along the way. I think it's supposed to be really spectacular to get to see like the fish jump and things like that during the right season, or the water run over all these rocks in this rapids area, but it had actually just rained and was kind of still raining at the moment. So it was nice, but definitely not a must stop for us on that particular trip.
And this was recommended to us by our, I believe, photography guide from the previous week.
Yes, that's true.
And he said it was really cool if you go in the right time. Guess we just weren't in the right time. We don't know anything about fish, so we don't know when their jumping season is, if that's a thing. But it was cool to see the rapids.
So then we continued on our way and made it to the West Thumb Geyser Basin, which is really neat. It's actually right next to Yellowstone Lake, And it's so cool. There's all these different very colorful pools. There's one that's super duper blue. It's actually called the Black Pool, but it's just really, really deep blue. And something to keep in mind, like we've mentioned in previous videos, is that Yellowstone is always changing. So whenever we stopped at the Grant Village Visitor Center last week, one of the rangers mentioned that the Abyss Pool had actually just changed because of some of the earthquakes that were happening underneath the Earth's surface constantly, are just always going on in Yellowstone. So because of that, it changed the pH and the temperature of this particular pool, and so it changes what microbes can live in there. So all of that to say, Abyss Pool had just changed slightly. It used to be more blue and now it was whiter. So that was neat just to see how like this is constantly happening. But one of the other main features of the West Thumb Geyser Basin is these geysers that are actually like within the borders of the lake.
Yeah, there were some that were actually underwater and submerged. I think that was the Fishing Cone Geyser. And fun fact about that, it got its name because you go fishing and Yellowstone Lake, and the fishermen would catch their fish, throw it in the geyser to keep it there, and when the geyser would erupt, their fish was cooked, and then they would take it home and eat it. There's also multiple geysers that are like on the shoreline, that are like really close or sticking out of the water. Those are kind of cool because we never saw geysers in the lake before anywhere else in the park. So a really cool thing about the Thumb Basin that you should go to. And this geyser basin has two boardwalks. It has a shorter one, I think it was like maybe a half mile. It's less than a mile. And then it has a much bigger one that goes down to the lake. I think that one's mile and a half, mile and a quarter maybe. So they're both pretty flat. So we did
Very
both
accessible.
of them.
Yeah.
Very good. Definitely worth doing both of them if you have time.
After that, we continued on our journey, headed back towards West Yellowstone and definitely to dinner, which we're really excited to tell you about in a minute. But on our way, we stopped at the Firehole Lake Drive. So like we've mentioned before, most of Yellowstone is just comprised of a larger upper loop and then a slightly smaller lower one. There's a couple offshoot roads, not much, but Firehole Lake Drive is one of them. And there's kind of some lesser known geysers and basins back there that we definitely recommend that you check out. It's again a very short drive, so it was really pretty and interesting. And there is one of the ones that's predictable back there. That is the Great Fountain Geyser, which we'll talk about later on in this video. After we went to Firehole Lake Drive, we stopped by Firehole Canyon Drive, which is a very similar name, but again, slightly closer to West Yellowstone. And normally you can go swimming back in this area, and it's right near Firehole Falls, but right now they have it closed. We assume it's because we saw an osprey nest with an osprey in it on our way out there, so we think that's kind of why is they're trying to protect the osprey, but we don't know for sure.
Both drives are really cool. Definitely do if you have the time. They're not like a need to see thing,
Right.
but they only take like 15-20 minutes to do. So if you're just like on your way out, just swing through them.
Yeah, they're both pretty short.
Pretty short and very cool. Then we went to dinner in West Yellowstone for some of the best burgers we have had in a long time at TR's Burgers.
Definitely recommend if you're staying in West Yellowstone. Could not say better things about TR's Burgers.
All four of us got a total of 3 different burgers, and they were all amazing.
So good.
We loved them. We did go back later in the week actually for them because we liked them that much.
They were so good. They were that good. You had to go back 2 times 1 week. Absolutely. Loved those. It's like, it's not necessarily a hole in the wall place, but it's not like one of the main places on West Yellowstone. Whenever you kind of drive around, there's places with big signs and neon and stuff like that. And it's almost on the edge of West Yellowstone on the north side as you headed towards Bozeman. So it's kind of like tucked away, but it was absolutely delicious.
And after dinner, just went to bed because it was a very busy Sunday. And on Monday, woke up, got breakfast at, I believe, Three Bears Lodge, which it was good. I mean, it was a breakfast. It wasn't anything to like write home about. We think Euro Cafe was better.
Yeah.
But it is a viable option. They did have more pancake options if that's what you're interested in. And then we said goodbye to Haley's parents.
Yeah, my mom and stepdad were headed back home, so we said goodbye to them and then spent the rest of Monday, other than work, just kind of recuperating. It was really excellent having people in town, and we loved it, but it was a lot busier of a schedule. And then, as we've mentioned before, just driving around Yellowstone takes so much time. So we were coming back way later than we're used to, so having Monday, and then actually we also ended up just doing the same thing on Tuesday and not doing anything then either. So having both Monday and Tuesday to rest and recuperate was huge.
Which we've learned is actually really important for RVing. Like if you're doing like a 1-week trip, you can pretty much just like muscle through like being tight or something.
Right.
But like long term, like you do need those catch up days. So like we needed to catch up on work for like our mental sanity. Like we were falling behind and getting too stressed out about it. And we also just needed to sleep more. We're both training for different like running races, so we need to kind of get back on our training schedule. And it was just nice to have those 2 days to have that flexibility to just, have that option.
One of the things I've kind of realized, so I'm kind of the main trip planner of our overall route, kind of planning where we're going to be for RVs or how long we're going to stay in certain sections. And most of this trip got planned months and months ago. So this was before we even started on our RV journey. And one of the things I've learned as we've gone on is to include basically 1 night a week of just have nothing planned. Don't do anything. You're just going to rest. You're going to have a night at the campfire, or you're going to play a video game or watch a movie or something like that. Because specifically for us, since we are working full-time during the day, we're not really using that time to go explore. Or we are sometimes, but very infrequently. So we're doing all of our exploring in the evening, and that's the time people normally sit around in the campfire and make a leisurely dinner and things like that, and that's just not what we're doing. So having that at least one night a week to do nothing, very important.
I would even recommend possibly having 2 nights a week if you're planning a really long RV trip, because like 3 days of constant travel and exploring is really awesome. We're not complaining at all here. This is just something we're learning from our schedule, from our experience. But I recommend having a mandatory 1 day a week recovery, possibly 2 depending on your lifestyle.
Yeah.
Then on Wednesday, after our 2 recovery days, which were much needed, we went to see Firehole Geyser, which is one of the hottest, if not the hottest, I don't remember.
It's one of the hottest springs in the park. It's on your way north as you head towards Norris. And we've just been kind of driving by it all the time, and it is constantly steaming and makes this like loud noise as you go by of all this pressure being poured out. So one of the things we learned from our wildlife guide we've mentioned in a previous video is that all the different steam producing features of the park, so fumaroles, which is almost only producing steam, geysers, or like various pools and basins, things like that, are almost always going to have that steam billowing off in the mornings because it's colder temperature. But in the afternoons, most of them you can't really notice. It's all stopped because the temperature's leveled out a lot more. Firehole Spring, every single time we drove by, is just like steam everywhere. Always billowing. So,
and if you go in the morning, it's like the whole area is foggy from the whole steam. I mean, it's
it
like
eats the road.
It's just a ton. It's really kind of cool to see in the morning, just in itself, and you just drive through it.
So that was on our way to the Norris Geyser Basin. So we headed there, which again is one of the other major areas in the park. There's a lot of major areas in the largest national park in the country.
But Norris Geyser Basin is more recently developed, I'd say, than the other geyser basins. I think the whole like parking lot and visitor center and kind of the more in-depth signs were put up like recently in the past like 5 years or so, whereas the ones on the other basins have been up for 10 plus years. So I think they're still trying to figure out like the parking situation. It seemed a little chaotic compared to the other ones,
and
but we went
so crowded if you're like driving there. They don't have enough parking. They, like you mentioned, they've added more within the past few years, and it's still not enough. So I think it was actually the most crowded with the least amount of parking of all the different like major attractions we went to. Yeah,
there's actually a path that cuts from the road to the geyser basin that goes across all of the parking lots that like skips them over. And this wasn't anywhere else because the parking gets so backed up. People are parking like a mile down the road.
Yeah, it was crazy.
It's really amazing, really worth it seeing. But this is probably the most one we'd recommend seeing in the evening.
Or in the morning.
We went in the evening and it was still busy. Like it wasn't jam-packed, can't walk on the boardwalk busy. It was probably one of the sections where we saw the most people out of the geyser basins. But definitely was worth it.
Until we didn't. Because as usual, who doesn't love a time of staying out way later than we should? Walking through the woods. But overall, the Norris Geyser Basin is known as the hottest and most acidic of the many geyser basins that are made up in Yellowstone. So this one has obviously a number of geysers and things like that, including one of the most famous, which you may have heard of, which is Steamboat Geyser. This is the largest one in the world. It can get over 300 feet whenever it shoots the water out of the ground, but unfortunately is extremely unpredictable. So you just have to be really lucky to get a chance to see this one go off.
It is still an active geyser.
Yes.
Like that. It just isn't predictable. So it'll go off like 2 or 3 times in a week, and then it won't go off for like a month. And it's really just luck based. We stood by it for probably half an hour trying to get really lucky.
Yeah.
Nothing happened.
So there was some water spurting out, but nothing anywhere near 300 feet.
No.
Other than that, we walked around. So there's 2 major loops within the Norris Geyser Basin, which I guess seems to be a constant theme for Yellowstone, is to have 2 loops. So because of that, we started with one section because this one geyser called the Ledge Geyser was going off. It actually wasn't really going off with water. It was just this like steam phase. I guess it's been going through for the previous few days, but it was like crazy amounts of steam pouring out of this and very loud.
And the boardwalk goes right next to it.
Yeah.
So it was like shooting up and steaming constantly, and you would go on the boardwalk and like the water would fall on you.
Yeah.
So we called it geyser kisses.
Yeah.
Because, it's just what happens. And it was cool. Kind of a unique thing. Important to note though, all geyser water has like some sulfur content in it. Yeah. So it did smell bad.
Yes, this is true. But again, like we mentioned before, just seeing a geyser go off, other than the like 5 that are predictable, is super hit or miss. So you never really know what's going to be going off and what's going to be in these steam phases or eruptions or whatever it might be, versus just things that are going to be dormant because it's not their time. After that, we continued on the other loop and got to see some of the really small geysers go off. So we got to see Minute and Veteran Geyser go off, which were all about a foot. But it was still kind of fun. Again, they're just like little baby geysers, and you still get lucky to see anything go off at all.
And this was really cool to see at sunset, which is when we were out there. However, it was not really cool when we were out there too late. And
walking through the woods.
The sunset that tends to happen, and we were the only ones out there.
And normally we have our like hiking packs and bring them everywhere you go, but we didn't realize this was going to be such a wooded area and part of that loop, and we didn't have our packs, but most importantly we didn't have our bear spray. So we were like, this doesn't seem like the best move ever, because it's like 9 o'clock.
So then we were, talking really loudly and making sure that everything in the area knew we were there. So there are ways to prevent bear encounters if you don't have bear spray. Just basically make noise.
But yeah, that was a little bit later than we intended, which if you watched any of our previous videos, you'll know is a pretty common occurrence for us.
Once we eventually made it back to the car,
safely,
drove back a couple hours and went to bed. Woke up Thursday morning and we're working, and then we realized that Great Fountain Geyser was actually going off in like the early afternoon. So we kind of packed up everything. One of the great things about having an RV in our house with us is we're kind of prepared to just work anywhere. So we brought our little generator, which is like a solar powered generator, and our Starlink in our car, and we drove out there, and we actually set up Starlink, and we were working in the car in the parking lot waiting for the Great Fountain Geyser to erupt.
Which was awesome. So it is one of the few predictable geysers. We mentioned earlier in the video whenever we talked about Firehole Lake Drive, but it is predictable within plus or minus 2 hours. So that means you could have a 4-hour window of waiting for this geyser. We were about 30 minutes late from the beginning of that 4-hour time span, which ended up being fine, and then we only had to wait an hour, which was great. It could have, again, been like 3.5 more hours just sitting and waiting for this to go off. But it was really spectacular. I think it was one of my favorite things that we did actually that week.
Yeah, it was really cool. And it was really unique because it only erupts twice a day, and it has such this big window that not a lot of people stick around. Like we saw probably 100 plus people drive by and just like look at it, and no one really stopped. Also, there's not a ton of parking there. So I mean, we pulled up, like I said,
very few.
With half an hour late into like the eruption window, and we pretty much got like the last parking spot.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna sit through and camp it out, which we think is worth it, you should do it if you have the time, you have the window, to get there probably like right at the beginning of the time slot, or possibly a little earlier. And then I mean, just like bring chairs, bring some food, have snacks, play some games, hang out.
Right.
Because it is
work if you can, I guess.
Because it's in like this huge like pool almost, and there's all like these different like levels that it trickles down on, and you can tell when it's within, I believe, half an hour of erupting, because all of the water starts overflowing over the little pools, and then you can go out to the boardwalk and get a closer view.
Yeah, so like you said, the water overflows over the pools as it gets closer, and the bubbles in the center start to get bigger. And it's a fountain geyser, so I think we've mentioned before, there's 2 major types of geysers. There's cone geysers, which is what we're most familiar with because of Old Faithful. But fountain geysers are these like flat pools that all of a sudden just burst straight out of the ground. So this particular one is quite large. It gets to over 200 feet. It was just really beautiful. It goes off, we learned from a geyser gazer, goes off about 5 or so times over the course of an hour, but the first one is the most spectacular and whenever it gets the largest. So definitely worth being there for the beginning, because that's whenever you're really going to see it get some height and some drama.
And when we say go off, it like shoots off like really, really high, really intense for a little bit, and then it calms down, and then it goes off again, and it like slowly gets lower and lower and lower, and then it stops for like 5 or 10 minutes, and then it goes off again, and lower and lower and lower, and every time it erupts, it like slowly gets lower and lower and lower until it just stops after an hour. We only stayed for I think 20 to 30 minutes of it, because then we had to get back to work.
But it was beautiful. Definitely recommend it.
Then on Friday, we're not going to talk too much detail into what we all did, because I made a whole video about it that I'll link here. We rented a really fancy camera lens from the camera store in West Yellowstone, which if you have the camera equipment, definitely do it. It was only like $30 for the whole day. And this is like a $2,000 to $3,000 camera lens that you can just use, and then you just use your SD card so you can have all the pictures. And we went out really early in the park to Hayden Valley to try and find some wolves and bison, and it was really just a fun time.
Saw a lot of bison, no wolves unfortunately. It was very, very foggy, so you couldn't see very far away, but you're like driving through this foggy, like mystical land, and all of a sudden there's just bison passing around in front of your car. So it was very neat. Got a ton of awesome photos. Again, we talked about more in another video that he filmed before, but definitely recommend, just taking out that photo, that lens, whatever you're able to do, to get some awesome photos and some great shots. And you have to go early for this because, like we mentioned before, the animals are out most whenever it's the coolest temperature, so the earlier the better.
Yeah, we got out there at like 6:30 or 7, and there was already a ton of other people out there. It's when all the photographers go out. So if you think we're lying to you, just go out there and see.
That's when the pros are out.
Many photographers, many pros, people who own these huge lenses and multiple cameras and all this stuff. And after we saw all the bison, we went to see some of the bears, which again, also talked about in the other video. But just very briefly, we saw 2 mom bears and their cubs separately. They don't hang out together. One had 2 cubs, one had just 1. And we were able to get actually really close to them.
Yeah.
Which was very cool. And some of the photographers were even like, well, this is like a really cool
it was great.
spot.
So we had an awesome time getting to see them. Again, we'll talk more about that in the other video as well. But that was awesome. So from there, we headed to Lamar Valley, which again is another major wildlife site. And we were looking for wolves. We were looking for bison. Definitely saw the bison. Didn't see any wolves, but we did get to see a coyote, which was just kind of random. And other than that, enjoyed our time. So from there, we drove the last little bit of the Yellowstone loop that we hadn't done, which was the north stretch from the Tower Roosevelt area on the upper northeast side to the Mammoth area on the northwest side. So we hadn't done this little strip yet, and we wanted to make sure we had done all the loops. Well, okay, I wanted to make sure we had done all parts of the loops.
Yeah, I didn't really care so much about completing all the loops, but Haley needs to check everything off the list. So we were going to that upper right exit near Gardner City, but on the way we stopped at the petrified tree, which is a petrified redwood tree, I believe, from like 50 million years ago.
Something ridiculous.
Which is really cool. And you get there, and it just, in my opinion, looks like a big tree stump.
It's a really, really big tree stump, first off. Not just in width, but in height. I think it's hard because like it was cool and it's a really short like drive down. So I think definitely worth seeing. You don't have to get out of your car. There's technically a trail, but you can see it from the parking lot. I think the hard part about it is it's like so long ago, we like can't even wrap our minds around it. You like look at it and you're like, okay, because like your brain can't comprehend that this particular object is 50 million years old. So I think it was cool, and I think it was worth seeing if you're going to do that section of the loop, but I don't think you need to like drive out of your way to see it, unless you're a big tree person, I guess. From there, we went to Undine Falls, which again is one of the other many waterfalls in Yellowstone as a whole. Like we mentioned before, Kepler Cascades is actually still our favorite, but was still the least crowded of all the ones we went to, so definitely recommend. But if you're driving by, it's worth a stop. And from here, like you mentioned, we went to Gardner, Montana. So I had heard good things. We went. It was okay.
It's kind of what you would expect from a smaller town city outside of Yellowstone. It is probably more developed than West Yellowstone. West Yellowstone seemed to be more like
touristy.
Only tourists, a lot of hotels. There are people who live there, but not a lot. Gardner is, people actually do live there. So there were like grocery stores and more gas stations and more things to go do, but it still wasn't like a big pop in town, if that makes sense.
I thought it was going to be cuter for some reason. I had heard like different things about it that apparently were not quite accurate, but something to mention. So you go through Mammoth Hot Springs to get there, which we've already seen and we talked about before, and you can take an RV in and out of Gardner. However, if you don't have to, we wouldn't recommend it. It is extremely steep. It is extremely steep, and there's so many switchbacks. We were in a car and we were like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. So
I think there's 10% grade for the majority of the road.
So if you don't have to take your RV out there, we would recommend that you don't. But we did go to Gardner, and one of the cool things about this town is that it has the Roosevelt Arch, which is the original entrance into Yellowstone, and I was really hoping to see it, so we had a picnic underneath the arch and then got to both walk through and drive through, and it was just fun.
We then made our way all the way across the park back to West Yellowstone, where we stopped for dinner yet again at TR's Burgers because it was just that good.
So good.
Haley got the exact same thing that she got last time.
It was delicious.
I decided to get what she got last time because she made it sound so good, and it was amazing. Once again, cannot recommend it anymore. Best burger place in West Yellowstone.
From there, some of the Fridays in the summer, they have music in the park, which is just across the street, so we could hear it outside from TR's, and then we walked over and listened to some of the music from, I don't know who it was actually playing, I don't know if it was a local artist or what, but that was kind of nice. And then we headed to City Creamery for some ice cream, because as I mentioned before, it's a weakness, and then ended our day.
Then on Saturday morning, we were actually leaving Rainbow Point. to head
Not
to
gonna
our
miss it.
heading to our campsite all the way across the park.
Yeah.
And being in the RV, bigger vehicle, we didn't want to encounter too much traffic. So we were trying to be like in the park at like 7. I don't think we really got there until like 8:30 or 9, just because everything takes longer in an RV than you would expect.
Even after all this time, we're still figuring out how long it takes to do things. So how long it takes for us to set up and take down, we kind of have going. But getting like water refilled, you never really know based off the water pressure, and it took a lot longer than we thought it was going to.
Mm-hmm. But so then we made it into the park probably around 9 o'clock, and then drove the hour and a half, 2 hours over to Fishing Bridge, because that's where our new campground was, by near that exit. And then we just kind of hung out in one of the parking lots there. Again, we have Starlink and a generator, so we were able to work for a couple hours there, get some work done, have lunch, until we were able to check into our new campground at, I believe, 2 or 3 o'clock.
Yeah, so we were headed to 3 Mile Campground, which is on the east side of Yellowstone. So in case you were curious, we were mentioning all these bears before, it is between Fishing Bridge Waypoint and the east entrance of Yellowstone. So that's kind of where all the bears that we've been seeing pretty much live. But we were headed straight through that section to 3 Mile Campground, which is 3 miles outside of the east entrance. And we moved over because later on in the week we're headed to Cody, Wyoming, and since it's 2 hours just to get across the park, we wanted to kind of cut our time in half by going over to the east side. So that was the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, and so we checked into 3 Mile, and 3 Mile is a smaller campground than all the other ones we stayed at. Really, really nice campground. It's kind of a quiet away. It doesn't have any hookups for electricity, but it does have toilets there, and like I said, we have our generator. You actually can't tent camp there because of the bears, so just keep this in mind. There is a higher likelihood you'll see a bear in that area. We didn't see any bears outside of the park, luckily, but there is also like a little river that runs through the campground that we went and walked through, so a very nice campground. To definitely recommend checking it out if you're in the area. Yeah,
so no tenting or pop-ups as well. You have to have a hard-sided camper. Just something to caveat there. And then we had another campfire this night, and then tried one of Cooper's personal favorites, which is Pudgy pies.
And if you don't know what a Pudgy pie is, I don't think you've lived quite yet. It is one of the most delicious yet hardest things to make, just because it never works out well. I'm sure my parents and family are laughing at this right now, but basically get these two, like, it's like a sandwich press thing on like 2 long sticks, and you put your bread in there and you put your fillings in and you clamp it down, and you just stick the whole thing in a fire. And it's like a cast iron clamp, and you just let it cook, and then you pull it out, and it's like this, and everything melts, and it's like a Uncrustable, basically, filled with whatever you want. So we put peanut butter, marshmallows, and chocolate in it, and it was phenomenal. So you need to do that.
But as Cooper says, every time it comes out the temperature of the sun. So you have to wait a while before you can actually eat these things. And
whenever you take it out of the fire, keep in mind those cast iron things are also hot. The temperature of the sun. And so you open it up, peel it out. Usually it gets burnt or it falls apart, but that's just part of the experience. And so you definitely need to do it. And if you do it for your first time, let me know in the comments, because we just love them.
So that was my first Pudgy pie experience, and that is how we end our day on Saturday.
Thanks for watching this week's recap of RV living. Next week, we are finally leaving the Grand Tetons in Yellowstone, which is where we have been for a full month. So follow along to see where we go next.